Hey YouTube, Matt here from Dark Meat Games to talk about the new version of Voxwell, version 0.2. With this update, you can now define your own voxel types without touching the code, set vertex colors, and work at whatever scale you like. In a lot of ways, this is an in-between update. You can now define your own voxel types, but the user interface is still really poor. However, before I improve that, I want to focus on a few other features like procedural generation and arbitrarily large structures, which will be part of the next major update, version 0.3. By far, the biggest request I heard from users was the ability to define their own voxels without writing any code. So let's take a look at how that works. First, let's open up an empty scene, and we'll drag out an empty voxel structure. If you look in the inspector, this voxel palette is the object that stores all of the voxel definitions and is used by the voxel structure to determine how to draw itself. If we click on that and then select the palette object in the project view, we'll see that the voxel palette is just a big array of voxel templates and one material called the atlas. The material will be applied to any voxel structure that uses this palette and uses our atlas texture, which we'll look at more later. The array of voxel templates is the main thing here. Basically, whenever you add a voxel to a structure, what you're really doing is just setting an integer value that references one of the voxel templates in the voxel palette. So if we go over to our voxel structure, select stone, and add the floor, what we've really done is just set all of those integer values to 1. So when the voxel structure tries to draw itself, it looks at its palette, and it looks for the element at index 1, in this case stone, and then uses that information from the template to draw itself. So if we were to go to our palette and replace stone with dirt, and we go back to our structure and draw it, we'll notice that the floor is now dirt, even though we didn't change anything other than the palette. So I'll go back to the palette and switch this back to stone. And redraw once more. And we're back to where we started. Now let's create our own voxel palette and define some of our own voxel types. First, we'll create our palette. We can either go to Assets, Create, Voxel Palette, or we can right-click, Create Voxel Palette. Let's rename it My Voxel Palette. Next, we'll need a material to work with. So create a material. We'll call it My Atlas Material. Great. Now, over here, we want to select our texture, and for this we want to use our Atlas Photoshop file. Before we go on though, I want to take a look at that Atlas. And so basically what this is just a 16 by 16 grid of tiles. What happens is when the mesh is drawn, it uses UV mapping to figure out which part of the atlas to show on the faces of the voxels. So we'll look at that a little bit more later, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what this looks like. The other important thing to know about the atlas is that if you were to create your own, your import settings would actually be different, and you would end up with these weird visual artifacts at the seams of the voxels. So if you ever create your own atlas, be very, very sure to come in here, change the texture type to advanced, come down here, turn off generate bitmaps. You could probably keep that on, but I find it's best to turn it off. Wrap mode, you'll want to be clamp. And the most important one is that filter mode should be point and not bilinear or trilinear. So we have our new atlas material. So let's apply that to our palette. And now let's go ahead and create a couple of voxel templates. So let's just say 4. And we've got some room to work with. So I always start out, and you should too, with an empty template. I'm not going to go into detail about exactly what that looks like because it's kind of boring. But whenever you're setting something to empty, or if you're removing something, really what you're doing is you're setting that integer value to 0. So if you don't have an empty voxel template in here, you'll be drawing voxels when you don't expect to. So let's create our own voxel template to add for element 1. So create voxel template, and we'll call this my stone template. Great. So we'll go back to the palette and we'll set element 1 to my stone template. And now let's go back to this voxel structure that we were using, and instead of the old voxel palette, we're going to use my voxel palette. Now, if you look at the current voxel type dropdown, you'll notice there's only the 2 voxel templates that we've added, empty and my stone template. Now if we draw, it's used our template, which is, because it's the default template, it's just a boring gray color. So let's go over and actually define our template. For now, we're going to ignore everything except for the atlas scale and the UV offsets. Atlas scale is the size percentage of each tile in the atlas. Since our atlas is composed of 16 by 16 tiles, the atlas scale should be equal to 1/16, or 0.0625. Next, we want to define the UV offsets for each face. The UV offsets are also percentage based and represent the bottom left position of our desired tile, with 0 being at the bottom or left of the atlas and 1 being at the top or right of the atlas. So let's open up our atlas to locate the tile we want to use. Since we want to use our stone tile, we want to figure out the position of this point. Right here, the bottom left of the stone. To find the x offset, we can simply count 16ths from the left. 0/16 is here, and 1/16 is here, our stone tile. So our x offset is 1/16, or 0.0625. This time we want to count from the bottom. Since there's 16 tiles here, we know that this one is at position 0, then we can figure out that this one's actually at position 15. So we do 15/16, or 0.9375. So we'll go over to my stone template, and we'll set the UV offset front, the x value, equal to 0.0625. and the y offset to 0.9375. Now, since we want all faces to use the same UV offset, we can copy those values for all of the faces. However, the easier way to do that would be to enable this checkbox, use front UVs for all faces. Now if we go to our voxel structure and hit draw, you can see that it's using the UV offset that we set for it. To make this a little bit clearer, let's go back to this and just change this a little bit so that when we go here and draw, we'll notice that the neighboring tile is starting to creep over. And that's basically just what the UV mapping is handling. So let's go back here, set it back to what it was, and draw one more time. Great. So we have our first voxel palette. Let's create one more. My dark stone template. And for this one, we're going to change the color value, and we're going to make it darker. Go back to the palette, add our dark stone, and now we should see my dark stone template. So I'm going to select that, and we're just going to add a couple. So our voxels aren't any darker. Now the reason for that is because the material we are using doesn't respect vertex colors. What we need to do is change the shader for our material to Voxwell Cutout Vertex Color. Now this shader actually uses vertex colors and multiplies them with the diffuse color or the texture. So if we go back, and that's a little too dark, so we'll just make it slightly darker, and we'll draw once more, and there you go. We could also change this to a nice red color. And red bricks. So that's the new vertex color support. What's happening is for each voxel, the vertices are given their own vertex color, and those are multiplied with the texture to give you the new color, the tinted color. Alright, and let's change this back to a dark color, and redraw. Great. Okay, and we're going to create one more voxel template to show off the other configuration options for the voxel. So create another voxel template, and we'll call this one My Metal Bars. So let's look back at our atlas, and we'll see that we've got this metal bar sort of jail door cell texture. And the UV offset for this one will be 14 from the left, 0, 1, 2, all the way to 14. And like our stone template, will be 15 from the bottom. So that's 14 divided by 16 for our UV offset, which is 0.875. And 15/16, or 9375. Again, we'll want to use the front UVs for all faces. Okay, so let's go back to our palette and add our metal bars. And let's add a couple. Well, it kind of worked, but probably not exactly what we were expecting. And it kind of looks strange from the different directions. That's not quite what we were going for. So let's go back to our My Metal Bars template, and we're going to enable this new option, Draw Faces in Center. So let's go back and redraw, and now you'll see that all of the faces, instead of being drawn on the surface, are actually drawn in the middle of the voxel. So that's still not quite what we wanted. So let's go back. So now we're only going to draw some of the faces. So we'll disable the top and bottom faces and the left and right faces. Now when we redraw, our windows are two-dimensional, which is what we were hoping for. So that's much better. And let's just go ahead and fill this in. and you've got yourself a nice window for a jail cell. This is also good for things like flowers or vines or anything that you want to be two-dimensional. So that covers the basic idea behind creating new voxel templates and using them in your structures. To get you started, I've provided an existing palette with a bunch of existing voxel templates. In order to prevent any problems with future updates, I recommend copying that palette and changing it, or creating a new palette altogether like we did in this video. The last thing I want to talk about is working at any scale. In the previous version, Voxwell didn't care what the scale of your structure was. It always drew voxels that were 1 unit in size. Now the scale of your voxel structure transform is used in all calculations. So if we go to our voxel structure and change its X scale to 0.5, and we add a couple voxels, we'll notice everything works as it should. And if we change this to 2, same thing, and anything we want. So that covers it for Voxwell 0.2. In the next update, I'll be working on chunking the voxel structures so that they can grow to be any size. No more dragging out tons of voxel structures and manually positioning. Just point and click and chunks will be created automatically. Thanks for watching.